in the small gallery over here today, and then I got to involve students in a little bit, and it was really, it's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the end result. So Factory, I've been working on just for the past year. It feels really young, and maybe again for context to students, I usually work several years before I put an idea down. This was really, I think I had like ideas brewing, but then the political moment that we're in was one that made me like spring into action. And so these, I was kind of dislocated. I'm like a mother in Arkansas, and I was busy, and I like couldn't be a part of these things that felt like really historic moment of women coming together to say like, no, things are going to be different, things are changing, and the sort of like heightened language, heightened visibility, heightened awareness. I felt like I couldn't go to New York, I couldn't be there. So like, what do I have? I have the work. My best voice is my work. And so I was incredibly moved by this, and I think with basically with this election, the activation of dissent is really exciting in our country. And so I think about how, even since maybe the last time I talked about this work publicly, things have changed a lot. Women coming out with stories of sexual misconduct and being heard and being believed. And I find all of this really exciting. It's a stew pot for amazing ideas. And so I've continued with ideas on hair, but then kind of brought it to this space of reflecting our contemporary moment. And so even though it's strange, this like internet meme on the left went around in my world quite a bit a few years ago, and it always stuck with me as like, what are these hairy leg stockings? It's so bizarre. I could never figure out if it was real or not. This is why I'm broke. It's like not that credible, but this was passed around a lot. But the text here underneath is really unnerving to me. So discourage a potential creeper with the hairy leg stockings. Once a guy lays eyes on your shapely and excessively hairy stems, they won't even bother giving you a second glance unless they're into that sort of thing. So this language is so problematic of, like hair being disgusting on a woman in a certain context unless it's fetishized, right? If we reduce it to that, I hope we can agree that this is problematic. And the same thing happens in this comic on the right. So, but what if it's not a joke? What if this is not ironic? Then I have to deal with this. And so then, again, it's a serious issue, but I started looking for it in pop culture. Like, so where are these like hair, this swimsuit's insane, the sort of like humor used to express like something unsexual, and then there's something animalistic about these knee pads, and I think it's a really strange space, right? And then sort of considering at least one artist that I see from the past working this way, Jean Dunning. I'm interested in her work. If you look at the sheet with the tongue coming through, that is recognizable in one of my pieces for sure. In this influence of kind of the body becoming dislocated in one sense, maybe the tongue sense, and then the body becoming strange in terms of this third arm coming out in the bed. And so how do we move the body into becoming a thing in and of itself? And so here are the blob and kind of referencing skin and fat as material. And so I began with all of this stuff kind of brewing, and I think you need that stew pot, again, for students to kind of like build up, looking outward, looking inward, looking at artists, let it all fester into making something. So I started making this work and thinking about how to kind of produce this setting, and I call it factory because I wanted a factory-like setting where hair is being added to the body as a means of protection. So if we have this society that will stop looking at a female based on her being hairy, maybe you can take control over that by being hairy on purpose, right? And so again, it kind of accesses this sense of desperation, but hopefully humor. I mean for this to be ironic, for it to be so absurd that it has an air of truth, right? And so for Going Black, I was more so thinking of ideas on disguise. And this work is not entirely hair related. I also think about nails and teeth and all of these parts of the body. Moving forward, I want to work more with skin itself, how they provide protection and defense. And again, I think that this is, it's supposed to be tongue-in-cheek. I'm supposed to be poking fun. Another side of this, I wanted to share just the back end a little bit, and my students got to work with me today. So, we create a fantasy world by putting boundaries around a photograph. So the fact that this is in my garage, surrounded by my vacuum and like all this other stuff that's not important to the photograph, that's just the reality of the work. And so the back end of building and constructing the spaces for me has been incredibly gratifying to be able to work sculpturally, to be able to work with materials and textures, and then bring them into the photograph as the end result has been really exciting. So the magic, I don't mind dispelling the magic a little bit, because the practical means of making work is that something existed in front of the camera. And so I'm just trying to make something exist, I guess. So tooth exchange, one of my former students had a mother that's a dentist, and she gave me like a handful of teeth to play around with. So the resources are out there. You just have to keep your eyes open, you know. Great. So again, kind of this suggestion of building up, if we add teeth, do we have more strength? Do we have more power? And then vulnerable parts are a collection of soft parts, soft hairless parts, and then this offering of a kind of piled wig in the center. A space that I may tap into, and this is kind of an odd image, is creating more sort of like fashion or headgear objects, much like that hair necklace, that are accessories. You know, if I don't want to look at something, can I just put my bangs on and strap them around my head? So there we go. So leg hair, and again, maybe if I point to how the magic happens, I'll show you the back end here. Is I also don't shoot the whole picture at once. I shoot in parts and then reassemble. So I do most of the work by myself. I did have a leg, and that's not my leg, but I had someone help me because it's really hard to run back and forth up a ladder, stick a leg through a hole. You know, the timer factor, and I use a remote sometimes. But there are some strategic difficulties in making this work, and often I need a button presser. And I can live with not being the one that presses the button. That's okay with me. This one I did call Factory. It's goopy. And then I started making, just to kind of like really keep playing with this level of playfulness, of kind of taking what feels like a candy-coated or advertising-based image and making it kind of strange, making it a little dark. I think the animated GIF plays into this point of accessibility and almost silliness that I find really appealing. I love these images projected in spaces that the subject that seems so static in an image can take on a life of its own. And so this is maybe one of my favorite pieces, the No. And so, you know, with stop motion animation, it's really easy to make things defy gravity, to make magic happen. Again, you know, if I'm willing to talk to the back end of this, all of those ponytails were duct taped into the back of the piece, and I moved them meticulously one by one to make individual frames. So it looks kind of easy, but it was a tortured process on this one, just a little bit. But again, a friend of mine talked to me about this and said, well, have you seen the lists of things that women put out of like what not to do if you want to be safe in public by yourself? Just one of them is to not wear a ponytail. Ponytail makes your hair grabbable by an aggressor. And I was like, well, I haven't seen that, and I wasn't thinking about that. But then this kind of like no gesture becomes even more impactful in my mind. And then I did start looking at those lists and some of the absurd lengths that women go to kind of feel safe in a public environment. And so all of these kind of like, it's research, but it's interesting and maybe sometimes academic and sometimes not research that can kind of like bring about the next idea. So one that I was just really recently working on is this, and it might change, so if you see it somewhere else looking a little different, that's okay, because I haven't made up my mind on this one, but I intend to call it the nail job. Great. Okay, so I like this kind of static repeated motion, and I feel like it's contemporary, and maybe something I hadn't addressed in these pieces is the shift. It's really hard for me to get past working with film in the grayscale. I loved even coming back to the foilism, the romanticism of material. I loved it, and it was hard for me to give that up. And I would say in ways I replaced it by working with more materials in the fabrication of the image to begin with. But these are all shot digitally, and I think that they should be. I think that the color is really important, and the sort of immediacy of digital has played a really great role in this work. And so finding the right tools for your content, where I didn't, there was a way that the hair pieces are so dislocated from contemporary culture through the grayscale, through entering this surreal space. And so I wanted this work to reflect the contemporary moment, and the influence of color seemed really important for that. And I felt like grayscale was too easy to associate with a flashback, with a memory. That's sort of the language of film that we see. And so the color played an important role in my mindset for this. Okay, so I'm gonna land and ask questions, but first I'll say you should come tomorrow to the drawing lab project at 1 o'clock, because so many people in the room helped with this amazing work of building a board. It's not actually going to look like what you see here, but maybe these guys were using drills for the first time, and I felt really good about that too. And then we're making sort of a backdrop like what I use so that visitors can come and kind of create their own vignettes within the space. So this is not what it will look like in its finished form, but I didn't want to give away all the secrets. And then we made these little tiny paintings that we were calling cookies to keep as props, to kind of, they're really wonderful just as objects on their own. This is not all of them, but so we're going to bring this kind of nice collective work together tomorrow and make some really great photographs that hopefully some of them will live in the museum next to the work while the work is installed. So come join us. But with that, does anybody have any questions?
Got one over here.
Digital ones or the film? So as I've been shooting digitally, I'm using a Canon 5D Mark III. I want to get a Mark IV soon. That's on my agenda. The resolution boost is significant there, but I'm a believer in the 5Ds. I think there were a lot of digital cameras that I had tried before getting that one, and that was the one that convinced me that I could work digitally, and not feel like I'm compromising anything. Yeah.
Me too.
You too. Yes. Agreed. Was there another question on the other side?
Yeah, I had a question because you mentioned like the GIFs and stuff, and those are just so associated with like social media, I feel like. So I'm wondering, have you put your work sort of subtly like on Twitter or something?
Yeah.
Done any of that? Kind
I
of
definitely
explored
have an
that?
Instagram page that I try to just keep active with almost solely this work, and I've had good response with those GIFs in that space and other places posting them. And so I think it is like, it's a language of our time right now, that sort of like short bursts. Maybe we don't even have patience for a normal video length of time, but this thing that just endlessly loops on itself, we can spend a minute with. So there's something strategic about that to some degree, but I also like in the sort of like more long-term gallery setting that it's just this endless loop. I think that informs the work for me, even in terms of some of my earlier thoughts on struggling with hair is like we we want it to grow more in spaces it won't grow. We want it to grow less in spaces that there's too much there. And like we're always in this battle of removal and regrowth and removal and regrowth. So I think that sort of like cyclical nature that's just constant back and forth of the GIF is something that I really love. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, it seems like nails could also work the same way, and you're obviously thinking about nails in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then my other question was about the backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
A number of them have these kind of three-dimensional dots, and
Yeah.
I was wondering if that's what's going on with that.
What's up with that? Yeah, I should have said something about
what
that.
are you sort of thinking about in relation to making these kind of like
Maybe I'm gonna go back.
better patterns, three-dimensional? I don't know.
Yeah. So let me specifically this one I had like probably the greatest intention within, but because in the photograph there's this drip going on throughout, I guess my intention is to build this space that seems like it's been repeating this action a lot of times, or at least that it's a well used and used again type of space. And so with the drips that kind of like maybe are more visible on the projector in this version, it just kind of like it reiterates that this is not a singular moment, but that we need this over and over and over. And then I think in general, I was talking about this with the students a little bit today as I'm asking them to like plaster and make these textures, is there's something purely pleasurable, I can admit that on one level, of like doing this. And then there's this element of what's more important to me, which is creating sort of a sense of history of that space, that it's not a new space, it's not even necessarily a clean space, but it's one that's been repurposed and reused. And I was telling them, like, I've lived in so many houses with popcorn ceiling, and that's like what you use to cover up a mistake or a problem. And that texture is usually, now with modern eyes, we're like, ugh, it's gross, And I think that embracing that as a means of like imbuing history or some long-term use of this space is what I'm interested in. And then beyond that, it's visual choices, where the red dots here just made me think of like the wound from pulling the teeth, and but it's like a playful, fun pattern that then becomes kind of uncomfortable, Yeah.
You talked a bit about the transition that you made from working primarily analog to the new digital process, and I think you didn't necessarily mention that you were working on, I guess, medium format or large format cameras for that earlier project.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself ever shifting back into that mode, or do you feel like this is it forever?
I don't know. That's hard to answer.
I mean, when would it ever be appropriate to use those tools again for you?
I think if I did, it's hard for me to think of a project that demands it. I think it would be purely based on like the pleasure of the material again, and I think that a lot of the previous work that was true of too. I think that the grain enters the equation, but I also think that I was stubborn and held out for a long time, where I just wasn't ready to make the shift to digital. And so for right now, as someone who teaches, has a family, and like studio work is already so crammed, and I kind of a few years ago had this like come to Jesus moment where it's like, if I'm gonna make work that doesn't cost a lot of money and take a lot of time, I need to shoot digitally, and there's an element of practicality that happens there, and I know that I will shoot more if I shoot digitally because there aren't limits, So I think that was really kind of the space. And then now I think if I went back specifically to grayscale, it would have to be really entwined into the content of the work, and then film itself. I would find some way to justify. I really want material and end result to be tied together. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Hello.
I'm going to ask this question because we showed the image of the protest.
Yeah.
I guess I'm sort of thinking about how hair is this subject matter for photographers and artists who are artists of color or queer artists.
Yes.
And it's very potent and politicized.
Yes.
And there's a kind of an urgency for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you sort of situate your own work with that history.
Yeah.
Just because this feels so different in tone.
Yeah.
Then it references fashion, and I wonder if that sort of has a factor in the way that you select models or
Yeah.
create some of these choices about hair and choices about composition.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and one that I like struggle back and forth with, because an artist like Lorna Simpson, maybe some of you guys know her work, African American female artist making work about hair and about that experience, and it's a perspective that I can't speak from experience on, and that's kind of where I start to draw lines in predominantly using my own body, I suppose. It kind of feels like a territory that I can claim authority over. And so even on the flip side, a lot of talks that I've given about the black and white hair series, people have said, well, when are you going to do this about men? They have this set of issues and struggles. And I was like, well, I don't think that I'm interested in that, And while I am interested in the politicization of hair itself, that's pretty critical. I think I just kind of have a difficult journey trying to speak toward the experience of people outside of myself, and so I want to add in my voice as a sort of female artist, but I've had a hard time kind of bridging that territory into speaking for on behalf of others, I guess. Is that fair?
Oh, I mean, I think it's more like kind of situating your own work with that.
Within that.
That's sort of the question.
Yeah, I hope it's in conversation, and I do think that there are differences in intent, and maybe my criticism is in the sort of cultural establishment of all of these guidelines, right, that apply kind of across the board, even at really young ages and up to older ages, and sort of, I don't know, I want to thumb my nose, or at least say that I think that these things are absurd and use absurd language to talk about that. And so I'm a lover of the work of so many of the people that I think that you're referencing, but I think that what I have to bring is this, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
So the animated GIF with the swinging ponytails, but it's wondering if the sort of practicalities of, so you spend a few minutes rearranging the ponytails, then you pull your hand through again, how do you get it in the right position? Are you looking at some other screen?
No. Yeah. Photoshop. So again, I'm embracing technology here. So it was shot separately. I did all of the ponytails in one set of frames, and then I did the movements of the hand in a separate set of frames, and then I brought them together. Because the camera stays still, it's easy to kind of shoot everything in parts and then bring it together. Yeah.
Who was your advisor for your master's degree?
Oh, I went to Indiana University, and it was a team, Jeff Woolen and James Nakagawa. James was here very recently.
So how has he impacted your photography?
Oh, yeah. So the program in Indiana is very rigorous in terms of conceptual development within your work. So I would say stylistically, between me and my colleagues, and even James and Jeff as mentors, the style of work was all over the place. But I think we were in the industry of ideas, how to have an idea and articulate it through images. So I feel like that's what they gave me, how to talk about ideas, both with words, but let the images do that work too. Yeah, they're great. Are you thinking about Indiana?
No.
Okay, I'm being a salesperson. Well,
I appreciate you sharing the back story of the frame, building the wooden structure in your 2-car garage, and you have to still fit your car in there.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes we see the frame, we see the finished piece,
Yeah.
but it's and also it's you don't have to have this massive workshop, and you don't have to have this beautiful desk and things. You can, maybe it's harder and it's more painful for your body, but
your living situation.
Yeah,
But
right.
yeah, I was talking about this with you, that being kind of willing to be young and scrappy for a while is really important. You're not just handed a studio space or the money to afford a studio space
Scrappy
immediately.
us old guys too.
Okay, it's easy to make work that looks finished
Yeah, right.
under scrappy circumstances and using the tools or the spaces that you have.
Yeah, yeah.
Which with the studio lights that we have for the piece tomorrow will be possible for all.
Yeah, we will be
Bring
making
your
it look
camera,
good
it
tomorrow.
will be lit.
Yeah.
I got it. Yeah,
That's
good. That was good.
Try out my
That's some young
vocab.
people talk. Yeah.
She's like, no, you can't say that.
You're not allowed to say that.
That was good.
Well, thank you guys.
Oh, wait, yeah, I have one last question. Has the process of doing self-portraiture and discovering your content, has that affected your personal relationship with like your own body and empowerment?
Yeah, so maybe something that I will say is that I'm not trying to like tell everyone to grow out their armpit hair or anything like that, and I don't necessarily participate that way myself either. So I think that I'm just more, I try to be lighthearted about it. Like I know that I also participate in this like hierarchy of rituals that is absurd, that is kind of useless because it's so cyclical like that. But so I'm laughing at myself too that I've bought into it. So I'll say the work is never really meant to be an indictment, but more so like, let's look at this, let's question this, and maybe even while we still participate, let's realize that this is ridiculous, you know? And so I think that's where I stand on it. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, again for coming and creating this wonderful exhibition and sharing your ideas and the history behind your work. I'd really like to thank again Andy Mattern and your students. Thank you guys so much for participating in this project. It's the first one in the art lab.
Right.
So you're our first artist to have an exhibition in the vault,
That's
and you're
great.
the first classes to participate in a collaborative experience for our guests. So thank you so much from all of us at the museum, and I'd love for you to share a round of applause.